Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're gonna be looking at a police encounter, and it starts out pretty normal, but
Yeah.
it definitely takes some turns. It takes some turns that I think are going to be pretty interesting to unpack.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So, to set the scene a little bit, our deep dive today is going to be taking us to a Rite Aid parking lot in Wisconsin,
Okay.
and we've got a transcript here. It's after hours at the Rite Aid. It looks like the Rite Aid is closed, and our main guy here, Travis Heinze, is sitting in his car in the parking lot when he gets approached by a police officer, Officer Jeffrey Aide. So that's our cast of characters, at least to start. And right away, I think this is interesting. A lot of people might think, what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with sitting in your car in a parking lot, even if it is after hours?
Yeah.
And you know what? Officer Aide kind of even says that.
Right.
He says he wasn't even going to write him a ticket.
Yeah, and that's important, because it establishes that, at least initially, there was no indication of any wrongdoing. Like, Heinz was just existing in this space, and the officer himself even acknowledged that. So it's not like he was doing anything inherently suspicious.
Yeah, he wasn't like blaring music or, doing donuts in the parking lot.
Exactly. And this is going to be really key later on as we see how things unfold because it speaks to Heinz's state of mind at the beginning of the encounter. He was willing to leave, which already shows a degree of voluntary compliance. He wasn't being confrontational. He wasn't trying to hide anything.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So this initial interaction really sets the stage, right? Because it begs the question, if everything was so casual, why did the situation escalate? And that's where things get really interesting, especially when the topic of ID comes up.
Right. And I think this is something, it's easy to assume, oh, an officer's talking to me, they must need to see my ID. But legally speaking, it's not always that clear cut.
Exactly. And this is where understanding your Fourth Amendment rights is so important. Just because an officer is out with you doesn't automatically give them the right to demand your identification. The law requires something called reasonable articulable suspicion, which basically means they need a good reason to believe you're involved in a crime. They can't just ask for your ID because they feel like it. There has to be something specific that's piqued their interest.
Reasonable articulable suspicion. It's a mouthful.
It is. It is. But it's such an important concept because it protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures, which includes being randomly asked for ID.
Okay, so we've got reasonable articulable suspicion. We'll unpack that a little more. But first, let's see how this actually plays out. So we've got Heinz sitting in his car. Officer Aide is approached. And they're having this, from what I can tell, it seems like a pretty calm conversation.
Yeah, and this is where that whole reasonable, articulable suspicion thing comes into play. Remember, it's not enough for an officer to just have a hunch or a feeling. They need something concrete to go on.
Right. So as the conversation goes on, you start to see Heinz is asking Officer Aide, like, what am I doing wrong? He even offers to exchange IDs with the officer.
It's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, it shows that Heinz might not be completely aware of all his legal rights in this situation. It almost feels like he's saying, like, look, I have nothing to hide. But on the other hand, you can also see it as like this attempt to sort of, meet the officer halfway, establish some trust, maybe.
Yeah, like a, hey, we're both just regular people here kind of thing.
Exactly. Human nature, right. But legally speaking, that offer to exchange IDs doesn't change the fact that the officer still needs that reasonable suspicion to demand it.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth about the ID. Heinz wants to know why the officer needs it. The officer's not really giving him a straight answer. And the transcript, you can almost feel the tension starting to build.
Oh, absolutely. It's like even just reading the words, you get this sense of, okay, something's off here.
Totally. Put yourself in Heinz's shoes for a second. Like, you're just chilling in your car, you're not hurting anybody, and suddenly you've got a police officer at your window asking for your ID, and you don't even know why. It's got to be unnerving. Right?
For sure. And I think that's a really important point because it highlights the power imbalance in these kinds of situations.
Totally. Okay, so the tension's building, right?
Yeah.
And as if things weren't already complicated enough, a second officer shows up.
Well, boy.
Yeah, Officer Taloff. And you'd think, okay, maybe another officer will help to, calm things down, right?
You'd hope so, right.
But that's not quite how it goes down. Because Officer Taloff makes this statement, and honestly, I had to read it twice because I couldn't believe it. She says, and I'm quoting here, "The Fourth Amendment gives you the right to bear arms." Yeah, Woe is right. And it's one thing if it was just some random person on the street, right? But this is a police officer, someone whose job it is to know and uphold the law.
Talk about a head scratcher.
Totally. Because it's not just like a minor detail, you know? It gets to the heart of what the Fourth Amendment is all about. Unreasonable searches and seizures, remember. It's a pretty big deal.
Right. Like, imagine you're in this already tense situation. You're trying to figure out what's going on, and then the officer says something that just totally throws you off because it shows a pretty big misunderstanding of basic constitutional rights. It's got to make you wonder, what else don't they know?
Exactly. Okay, so then Officer Taloff tells Heinze he's being detained. Like, straight up, you're being detained, get out of the car.
And that's the big question right there, isn't it? Was the detention even legal at this point? Did they actually have enough to detain him?
Yeah, because remember, we still haven't really established what Heinze was suspected of doing in the first place.
Right. Exactly. So to figure that out, we've got to go to the law, right? And in this case, we're looking at Wisconsin law specifically.
Wisconsin, here we come.
So in Wisconsin, Section 946.41 of their statutes, that's the one that outlines the requirements for detaining someone. And I won't bore you with all the legal jargon.
So give us the gist.
The gist is that police officers need to have reasonable suspicion to detain someone. They need to believe that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. And the key word here is reasonable.
There's that word again, reasonable.
Right. And, it's not about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt at this point. But it means that the officers need to have some kind of concrete reason. They can't just detain someone based on a whim or because they're feeling suspicious.
Okay, so let's look at the facts as we know them. We've established that simply being in a parking lot after hours, not a crime.
Right. Correct.
Heinze was in his car, minding his own business, not causing any trouble.
Mm-hmm.
He offered to leave when the officer approached. He even offered his ID, which, might not be the best legal strategy, but it does show that he was trying to cooperate, right?
Right.
So, based on what we know, did the officers have reasonable suspicion to detain Heinze? So it's like, where do we even go from here? We've got this situation, right? And it seems like nobody's really on the same page.
And that's what makes these situations so tricky. Because the law, it's not always a clear-cut thing. There's a lot of interpretation involved.
So you're saying, even with the reasonable suspicion thing, it's not like there's a checklist the officers have to go through, right?
Right. Like, they might have pointed to Heinze's behavior, maybe his confusion or his initial offer to exchange IDs, and said that based on their training, that raised some red flags.
So it's like their word against his. That seems kind of, I don't know, unfair.
Well, and that's exactly why it's so important for everyone to understand their rights, right? Because if Heinze had felt like his rights were being violated, he could have calmly and clearly said, I don't consent to giving you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong.
Do you think that would change things?
It's hard to say for sure, but at least it puts your cards on the table, It lets the officers know that you're aware of your rights and that you're not just going to roll over.
That's a good point. So if you were in Heinze's shoes, knowing what we know now, how do you think you would have handled that whole thing?
Honestly, I don't know. It's so easy to sit here and analyze it after the fact, But in the heat of the moment, with the adrenaline pumping, it's different. And I think that's something important for everyone listening to keep in mind.
Totally. Because this deep dive, it wasn't about saying who was right or wrong. It's about looking at these real-life situations, these encounters with law enforcement, and really unpacking them. Because the law, especially when it comes to your rights, it's complicated.
Absolutely. And it's constantly evolving, too. What might be considered reasonable suspicion today might be different tomorrow. That's why it's so important to stay informed, to know your rights, and to be prepared to advocate for yourself if you ever find yourself in a similar situation.
Exactly. Because like we saw with Heinze, what starts as a seemingly harmless encounter can escalate quickly. And knowing your rights, staying calm, communicating clearly, those things can make all the difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
Always is. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.